My name is Isabella Moreno, and for years I lived with the belief that my family's inheritance would be the thread tying me to security, belonging, and dignity. It was spoken about like a sacred promise, whispered in casual tones at family dinners, and carried as a symbol of our lineage. I had been told, time and time again, that when the time came, the fortune left behind would protect me as much as it had protected them. If you're watching this, please hit the like button. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you know, and sharing your own experiences helps remind people like me that we're not alone. I grew up clinging to the image of the inheritance like a child clutching a lifeline. The family estate, the properties scattered across cities, the accounts spoken of in hushed pride. They all painted the picture of permanence. It wasn't just money. It was supposed to be a legacy, a name that endured, a seat at the table no one could deny me. But as I entered adulthood, cracks began to form in that perfect picture. Subtle comments hinted at something darker beneath the polished surface. I noticed how relatives avoided speaking too openly about certain investments, how papers were always signed behind closed doors, how sudden bursts of wealth appeared after periods of silence. I didn't understand then. I only carried a gnawing sense that this inheritance was not what it seemed. For a long time, I ignored those signs. I told myself it didn't matter how the money came to be, as long as it meant stability. I worked hard, studied, and built my own career, but there was always a quiet reassurance at the back of my mind. When storms came, the inheritance would be my anchor. That belief became my shield, a way of coping with the loneliness I often felt in a family that praised appearances more than affection. Then came the whispers of the will. News spread that my father's affairs were being prepared for division, and every relative leaned in with sharpened interest. I convinced myself that at last, after years of being the quiet observer, my place would be secured. I rehearsed the idea of receiving my share, not as charity, but as recognition that I belonged as much as anyone else. What I didn't know was that this promise, this so-called legacy, was built not on love or fairness, but on shadows. And shadows don't protect you, they consume you. That season of expectation would become the first step toward my unraveling. Because what I thought would be my salvation would reveal itself to be my downfall, a poisoned gift, carrying within it the seeds of betrayal, disgrace, and a cage I never imagined stepping into. At the time, I held on to hope. I told myself that family might wound, but it would never destroy. That belief was naive. Soon, I would discover that family, when blinded by greed, can become the sharpest knife pressed against your back. The first real fracture came not with an argument, but with a document. I had been told for years that the family's money was the result of tireless work, smart investments, and a name that carried weight in the right rooms. It was painted as a story of discipline and vision, a legacy earned. But the papers I came across told a different story. They were contracts and transfers, documents buried in filing cabinets that no one expected me to touch. I had been asked casually to review some numbers when a relative grew careless, assuming I wouldn't notice the inconsistencies. But I did, and what I saw made the blood drain from my face. Accounts offshore, false companies registered to shell addresses, transactions routed through people I barely recognized as distant cousins. This wasn't the architecture of wealth, it was the scaffolding of corruption. It dawned on me that the inheritance I had always been promised was built on a foundation of lies. My father's voice, so often filled with pride when he spoke of his empire, now replayed in my mind like a warning. He had never said the words out loud, but I began to understand the reason behind the secrecy, the closed-door meetings, the sudden bursts of money. None of it was clean. For days, I carried the weight of this knowledge like a stone lodged in my chest. At family dinners, I listened to my relatives speak with false nostalgia about the hard work that had built everything, while I sat there hearing the truth behind their words. Every toast, every mention of legacy now sounded hollow. The pride that once made me feel like I belonged now tasted like poison. I thought about confronting them, about asking how they could justify building a life on the backs of others' suffering. But I knew what the response would be. They would dismiss me as naive, call me ungrateful, tell me I didn't understand how the world worked. And worse, they would close ranks, making sure that any trace of doubt was buried under layers of denial. Still, I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't go back to believing the inheritance was a gift. It was a chain. And if I accepted it without question, I would become part of the corruption that already stained our name. Late at night, I lay awake imagining my future tied to that money. Would I spend my life trying to hide the truth? Would I be dragged down with them if everything unraveled? The thought terrified me. Yet what I didn't realize then was that uncovering the truth was only the beginning. Because secrets in families like mine don't stay secrets forever. When they surface, they don't just break illusions, they break people. And soon, it would be my turn to feel that break, as every shadow I had uncovered was turned against me. The day of the reading of the will should have been a formality, another step in the ritual of inheritance. For years, I had heard whispers of this moment as though it were sacred, the gathering where generations would confirm their places in the family's story. I entered the room with quiet hope, still clinging to the idea that even if the money was tainted, the acknowledgement of my place would at least give me something to stand on. The atmosphere was heavy before a single word was spoken. Relatives filled the long mahogany table, some wearing the stiff politeness of formality, others betraying anticipation in their restless movements. My aunts sat with pursed lips, my cousins exchanged knowing glances, and my siblings leaned back in their chairs as though the outcome had already been decided. The air was thick with something unspoken, and I could feel the weight of eyes on me before the papers were even unfolded. When the official words began, they were spoken in the detached tone of legality, but each sentence felt like a blade slicing through the thin fabric of belonging I had wrapped around myself. Portions of the estate were described, properties listed, accounts named. Each share was distributed with precision, until mine. My name was mentioned almost as an afterthought, a line buried between grander declarations. What should have been recognition sounded instead like dismissal, a token gesture meant to silence me rather than include me. The reaction from the others was immediate, though not loud. My siblings made comments meant to sting without sounding cruel. Remarks about how I should be grateful for anything at all. An uncle muttered that ambition was unbecoming, while a cousin smirked as if enjoying a private victory. No one raised their voice, yet the condemnation was clear. I was not one of them. I was the intruder, the one who had dared to look too closely at the foundation of the wealth they guarded. I sat in silence, listening as they spoke of me as though I were not in the room. They accused me of expecting too much, of never appreciating the sacrifices others had made. It was said that my distance from the family disqualified me, that my independence proved I didn't need as much. Every word was dressed in civility, but underneath was the truth. They wanted me erased from the story. As I listened, a wave of humiliation rose inside me. My chest burned, not with anger at first, but with the crushing weight of being exposed. They had found a way to make me appear greedy, ungrateful, even disloyal. And worse, they did it in a way that left me defenseless. If I protested, I would only confirm their accusations. If I stayed silent, I became complicit in their version of the truth. The realization cut deeper than the meager inheritance left in my name. This was not just about money. It was about power. The power to define who belonged and who did not, who carried the family forward and who was cast aside. That power had always rested in the hands of those willing to manipulate appearances, and now it was being used against me. By the time the documents were signed and the pens set down, I felt smaller than I had in years. The table that should have united us had instead become a weapon, and I was the target. They left the room with satisfied faces, congratulating one another on what they called fairness, while I sat frozen, knowing fairness had never been part of the design. As I walked away, I realized this day had marked a turning point. My illusions about the inheritance were gone, shattered beyond repair. But something else had taken root beneath the humiliation, a seed of defiance. Because if they could strip me of dignity so easily, then I would have to learn how to build it back on my own terms. The betrayal at the table should have been enough, but it was only the opening act of what would come next. What I thought was humiliation quickly evolved into something far more deliberate, a campaign designed to strip me not only of my inheritance, but of every fragment of security I had built on my own. It began with whispers of legal challenges. At first, I was told by relatives that certain documents tied to the will might have been misinterpreted. They hinted that my portion was larger than what I deserved, that I had somehow manipulated the process. Their tone was careful, almost polite, but beneath it I heard the accusation, I was a thief in their eyes. Soon after, I received notices delivered to my door, formal letters, stamped and sealed, accusing me of taking what was not mine. They claimed my property, the small home I had purchased years earlier with money earned through my own work, had been bought with family resources. They insisted that funds had been misallocated, that I had benefited unfairly from accounts tied to the estate. I knew the truth. Every payment, every sacrifice that had gone into that home was mine alone. I had taken no handouts, no favors. But truth mattered little against the weight of carefully constructed lies. The family had resources, connections, and influence. They could twist narratives until even those who once believed in me began to question my integrity. The legal battle drained me quickly. Lawyers who once spoke with reassurance began to withdraw, murmuring that my case was difficult, that the documents presented by my relatives carried weight in the courts. Papers appeared with signatures that looked like mine, but were not. Records surfaced showing transactions I had never made. I realized then that this was not merely a misunderstanding. It was sabotage. The house I had called my sanctuary became the first casualty. A judge ruled that ownership was disputed and ordered me to vacate until the matter could be resolved. I still remember standing in the doorway with the keys in my hand, the walls echoing with emptiness. The rooms that once held my laughter and solitude now felt like a coffin for the life I had built. Neighbors whispered as I packed my belongings into boxes. Some offered sympathy, but others repeated the rumors they had heard. That I had taken more than I deserved, that I was greedy, that I had betrayed the family. Their words stung more than the cold air biting at my skin. Dignity, I realized, was the first thing to vanish when your name was dragged through the mud. Each night, I lay awake replaying the events, searching for the moment it could have been different. I told myself that if I had stayed quiet, if I had ignored the inconsistencies in the family fortune, perhaps they would have spared me. But deep down, I knew the truth. Silence would never have saved me. They needed a scapegoat, and I was the easiest one to cast aside. The fall was swift. My savings dwindled under legal fees. Friends grew distant, unsure of where the truth lay. I became the story whispered at gatherings, the cautionary tale of ambition punished. Every step I took seemed to pull me deeper into quicksand. The more I fought, the faster I sank. Losing the house was more than losing walls and a roof. It was losing the symbol of everything I had earned outside of my family's shadow. Standing in the empty driveway after the movers left, I felt stripped bare, as though the last barrier between me and their control had been torn away. Yet, even as I stood there in defeat, a small, stubborn flame burned inside me. They had taken my inheritance, twisted the truth, and stolen my home. But what they had not yet taken was my resolve. And though I didn't know it then, the deeper they pushed me into despair, the stronger the need for my return would grow. If losing my home felt like a wound, what came after was the salt that burned it raw. Up until then, my battle with the family had been confined to private halls, lawyers' offices, and courtrooms that smelled of old paper and cold judgment. But soon, the war spilled into the streets, into the eyes of strangers, and onto the pages of newspapers that carried my name like a stain. The first headline appeared in a local paper. It framed me not as a daughter fighting for truth, but as a woman accused of exploiting her family for personal gain. The article presented the family's version of events as fact, painting me as greedy, manipulative, and shameless. There was no mention of the years I had worked independently, no recognition of the sacrifices I had made. My identity was rewritten in bold letters that thousands of people read over their morning coffee. From there, the stories multiplied. Online blogs picked up the narrative, adding sensational twists that had never happened. They claimed I had forged signatures, stolen assets, even orchestrated fraud with outside partners. Each article blurred fiction with fact, but in the public's eye, details didn't matter. What mattered was the story of a fallen daughter, the scandal of a family at war, and the entertainment of watching someone's life collapse in real time. I felt it immediately in the way people looked at me. Neighbors who once waved politely avoided my eyes, some crossing the street to keep distance. At the grocery store, I heard whispers behind my back. Soft enough to pretend they weren't meant for me, loud enough to ensure I heard them. Strangers began to recognize me, not as Isabella Moreno, but as that woman from the papers. Friends who had once filled my evenings with laughter grew quiet. Some stopped answering my calls altogether. Others spoke carefully, choosing their words with the precision of people who no longer trusted me. I could sense the doubt in their voices, the hesitation that came from reading too many headlines and wondering if maybe the stories were true. Isolation crept in slowly, until one day I realized I had no one left to confide in. But the humiliation didn't stop with whispers. It became performance. My name was dragged into community meetings, where people spoke of me as an example of moral decay. Acquaintances retold the family's accusations as if they had witnessed them firsthand. Even those who knew nothing about me seemed eager to join in the chorus, because scandal is easier to repeat than truth. At night, I would lie awake, replaying the words I imagined them saying, that I had brought shame to my bloodline, that I had betrayed the trust of my parents, that I had reached too high and deserved to fall. These were not just comments. They became a chorus in my mind, echoing until I could no longer separate my own thoughts from the voices of my accusers. I began to shrink in public. I avoided eye contact, wore plain clothes, and kept my head down when walking through crowded streets. My once confident stride became hesitant, as though I were apologizing simply for existing. The dignity I had carried, fragile but intact, was stripped from me piece by piece until all that remained was shame. Yet even in my lowest moments, I could not shake the feeling that the family's hand was behind every headline, every rumor, every whisper. They had the resources, the connections, and the hunger to destroy me completely. They weren't content with taking my inheritance or my home. They wanted to erase me from the world's respect, to reduce me to nothing more than a cautionary tale. I thought often of my younger self, the girl who had once believed the inheritance was a promise of safety. She seemed like a ghost to me now, someone naive enough to believe that family could never destroy its own. I mourned her innocence as much as I mourned my reputation. The hardest part wasn't the loss of possessions or the humiliation in public. It was the silence of those who once claimed to care for me. Friends I had trusted for years turned away. Colleagues kept their distance. Even strangers I had helped in small ways avoided acknowledging me. Loneliness became my closest companion, heavier than any physical chain. But beneath the shame, something stirred quietly. The fire of defiance that had sparked at the table during the reading of the will had not gone out. It burned faintly, reminding me that while they had stolen my dignity, they had not yet taken my will to survive. And though I was far from imagining how, I began to sense that one day this storm would not only pass, it would fuel the very strength I would need to rise again. The humiliation in the papers had been unbearable, but what came next was worse. The stories, the whispers, the accusations. They were all stepping stones leading to the moment when the world no longer saw me as a woman stripped of dignity, but as a criminal who deserved punishment. It began with an official notice slipped under the door of the temporary apartment I had managed to rent after losing my home. At first, I assumed it was another summons, another demand for documents or testimony in the endless disputes. But as I scanned the pages, the words blurred into something I could hardly comprehend. The state was charging me with conspiracy, fraud, and participation in financial crimes tied directly to my family's inheritance. The accusations were so precise they almost seemed rehearsed. Transactions were listed in detail, dates and signatures matched against forged evidence I had already suspected existed. Reading it, I felt the same cold hand on my back that I had felt at the table during the reading of the will. the certainty that this was never about fairness, but about erasure. My relatives had orchestrated this carefully, planting the narrative until it became strong enough for the law to carry it forward. The day they came to arrest me, I remember the sound of my own breath echoing louder than the knocks on the door. The world outside was indifferent, the city still moving in its rhythm, but inside my body time fractured. I felt exposed as I was taken away, neighbors watching from windows, their eyes filled with the satisfaction of confirmation. To them, I was no longer the victim of rumor, I was the proof of it. The prison walls closed around me with an immediacy I could not prepare for. The air was heavy, thick with despair, the kind that clings to your skin and refuses to let go. I was processed, photographed, and stripped of the last remnants of control. In a single day, I was reduced from a woman clinging to scraps of dignity to an inmate, identified not by my name, but by a number. Inside the cell, I felt the depth of isolation in a way I had never known. The walls were bare, the mattress thin, the silence broken only by distant noises of locks and shouts echoing through corridors. I thought of my family, of how they might have celebrated this outcome behind closed doors. I imagined their words, cold and self-righteous, that justice had been served, that I had been exposed. The thought of them using my imprisonment as proof of their own innocence sickened me more than the stench of the place. The days blurred into one another, each one a cycle of confinement and despair. I was questioned repeatedly, my denials dismissed as rehearsed lies. Prosecutors repeated the family's narrative with conviction, pointing to documents I knew were false but could not disprove without resources I no longer had. In their eyes, I was not a daughter betrayed, but an accomplice caught. Loneliness weighed heavier than the iron bars. Friends who had hesitated before now vanished completely. Letters I wrote went unanswered. Calls went ignored. To the world outside, I had ceased to exist as anything but a criminal. And in my darkest hours, I began to wonder if perhaps that was how my life would end. Forgotten, buried under the lies of those who carried my blood. But somewhere in the stillness of those nights, lying awake on the thin mattress, I felt a flicker of something unexpected. It was not hope, not yet, but defiance. I thought of the girl who had once believed the inheritance was her salvation, and I realized she was gone. In her place was someone harder, someone who had seen the worst that family and the world could do. Prison was meant to break me. It did shatter pieces of me. Pride, dignity, the illusion of safety. But what it could not erase was the core that still whispered that truth mattered, that survival was possible, that I was not done. As the weeks turned into months, I began to see that this place, as suffocating as it was, would not be the end of my story. It would be the crucible, and when the time came, the same walls meant to silence me would become the reason I learned how to rise again. Prison was never meant to be a place of growth. Yet in its harshness, I discovered the first fragile seeds of resilience. At the beginning, I resisted everything: the routine, the cold food, the eyes that studied me as though I were both threat and entertainment. I clung to the idea that I didn't belong there, repeating it silently as if the insistence alone might change the reality. But the walls did not move, and the bars did not bend. To survive, I would have to change. The first lesson came quickly. Invisibility was a kind of protection. Those who flaunted their pride became targets. Those who resisted the rules too loudly were punished. I learned to lower my gaze without appearing weak, to speak softly without being silent, to carve out a space where I was neither prey nor predator. It was a balance as fragile as glass, but it kept me afloat in an environment designed to drown the unprepared. Over time, I began to observe the women around me. Many carried stories as twisted and painful as mine, lives dismantled by betrayal, desperation, or circumstance. Some had been crushed by poverty, others by addiction, and a few by injustices that mirrored my own. Their presence reminded me that I was not unique in my suffering, though my story was wrapped in the luxury of a family name that had now become a curse. In the evenings, when the noise of the day finally settled into a heavy silence, I found myself listening to the rhythm of the prison, the clanging of distant doors, the murmurs that traveled through walls, the occasional cry muffled by exhaustion. All of it became a strange kind of soundtrack. In those hours, I reflected on who I had been before. The daughter waiting for recognition, the woman clinging to dignity. That person felt distant now. In her place, a harder version of myself was beginning to form, shaped by necessity. I found small ways to endure. I read whatever I could get my hands on, turning borrowed books into lifelines. I studied legal guides, searching for cracks in the accusations against me. I wrote notes to myself, reminders that truth still existed even if it was buried beneath lies. Knowledge became a weapon, sharper than any blade I could have carried. Slowly, I also began to form alliances. Trust was dangerous in a place where betrayal could be a survival tactic, but it was impossible to live entirely alone. There were women who saw me not as a rival, but as someone who, like them, had been stripped of everything. We shared food when rations were scarce, exchanged quiet words of encouragement when the days felt endless, and reminded one another that even within these walls, humanity could flicker. The guards watched us constantly, some with suspicion, others with indifference. I often wondered if they knew the full weight of the lies that had placed me there, or if to them I was just another name in the system. Either way, I learned to move carefully under their gaze, never giving them reason to turn suspicion into punishment. Survival meant learning not only the rules, but also the spaces between them. Months passed, each day blending into the next, yet within the monotony, I began to notice something unexpected. The despair that had once consumed me no longer held the same power. I still felt it, sharp and cold in quiet moments, but it no longer dictated every thought. In its place was a determination that I could not have found anywhere else. I realized then that prison had not broken me. It had stripped me bare, yes, taken away my freedom, my dignity, my place in the world outside. But in that emptiness, it had also forced me to confront the raw core of who I was. And what I discovered was not weakness. It was endurance. By the time I marked my first year behind bars, I understood something I hadn't before. This was not the end of my story. It was the training ground. Every hardship, every humiliation, every sleepless night was shaping me into someone who would not only survive but rise. The family who thought they had buried me had, without realizing it, placed me in the one place strong enough to forge the woman I was becoming. Time in prison stretched like an endless corridor, one that seemed to lead nowhere. I had adjusted enough to endure, to find fragments of strength in reading, in observation, in the alliances I built carefully. Yet deep inside, I carried the fear that endurance might be all there was, that my story would end within those walls, written by the lies of others. That belief began to shift the day I noticed a different kind of attention. A new set of eyes studied me during a routine review of cases. Eyes that didn't see me as another name on a file or a number on a sheet. Word spread quietly that a young lawyer had taken interest in inmates whose convictions carried questionable evidence. At first, I dismissed it. Too many times I had been told that my situation was hopeless, that the documents stacked against me were too precise to unravel. But something about her persistence lingered. When she first examined my case, I heard later that she found the inconsistencies glaring. She noted that signatures looked rehearsed rather than authentic, that transactions repeated patterns often found in orchestrated fraud, not in individual mismanagement. Where others had shrugged, she saw deliberate construction. I was told she described my trial as one-sided, marked by a narrative that had been fed carefully to the court by people with more resources than I could ever hope to match. For the first time in years, someone outside those walls seemed to recognize what I had always known. I had been framed. The shift was subtle at first, almost fragile. There were no promises, no guarantees of release, only the quiet possibility that truth might find its way through cracks. Yet even that possibility felt like oxygen. I found myself standing taller in the yard, moving with more focus in the routines of each day. The thought that someone, somewhere, believed in my innocence was enough to begin stitching together pieces of hope I thought were lost forever. Inside, I turned that spark into fuel. I began writing again, not just notes for myself, but full accounts of what had happened. Every memory, every detail, every inconsistency I could recall. I treated each page like a weapon, proof that I was more than the role they had forced upon me. Other women watched me filling notebooks late into the night, and some began sharing their own stories, trusting that if I still believed in justice, maybe they could too. The prison itself did not change. The walls remained the same, the routines still stifled freedom, the guards still looked at me with suspicion. But within me, something had shifted. I no longer felt like a ghost drifting toward nothingness. I was preparing, even if I didn't yet know for what. There were setbacks, of course. News reached me of my family continuing their performance outside. They described me as guilty even after conviction, claiming to anyone who would listen that I had stolen from them, that my imprisonment was a necessary end to my greed. Their voices still carried more weight than mine, their lies spreading more easily than my silence. Yet for the first time, I did not crumble under the weight of it. I reminded myself that survival had carried me this far, and now survival was transforming into resistance. The lawyer's work continued quietly. Rumors reached me that she had found discrepancies in the financial trail, documents that contradicted one another, evidence that had been overlooked. I imagined her sitting at her desk late into the night, piecing together fragments of truth on my behalf. The image became a lifeline. For years, I had carried the fight alone, shouting into a void that never echoed back. Now, even if faintly, I felt an answer returning. In the solitude of my cell, I began to dream differently. Not of freedom handed to me, but of reclaiming it piece by piece, of walking out not as the broken woman they expected, but as someone who had endured, resisted, and prepared. Prison had stripped me of my dignity and marked me with shame, but it had also carved into me a resilience that could not be forged in comfort. Now, with the seed of hope planted, I began to believe that survival was not my only destiny. Renewal was possible. And if renewal was possible, then perhaps revenge, not in cruelty, but in truth, was inevitable. The day of my release arrived without ceremony. There were no celebrations, no banners, no eager arms waiting on the other side of the gates. Freedom came in the form of a signature on a piece of paper and the sound of metal locks disengaging. After years of confinement, the air outside should have felt like salvation, but it carried a weight that I was not prepared for. The sun seemed too bright, the sky almost mocking in its vastness. I stood for a long moment on the steps, the cold wind biting my skin, realizing that the world had kept moving while I had been frozen in place. People hurried along the sidewalks, cars weaved through traffic, laughter spilled from a nearby cafe. To them, it was just another day. To me, it was the first day of a life I was no longer certain how to live. Though the charges had been dropped, the words that had condemned me lingered in the air. The newspapers did not print retractions with the same eagerness they had used to announce my downfall. The community that had whispered about my guilt did not rush to correct itself. Instead, I returned to a world that saw me not as innocent, but as someone who had simply managed to escape punishment. Everywhere I went, I felt the eyes of suspicion. Strangers glanced at me with recognition, their faces hardening into judgment. Employers turned cold the moment they saw the gaps in my history. Even old acquaintances avoided my presence, uncertain whether my story was one of injustice or shame. The silence they offered spoke louder than any accusation. In their minds, I was tainted. Freedom came with scars that no one could see. At night, I woke to the phantom sounds of prison, the clang of distant doors, the shuffle of footsteps in hallways, the echo of muffled cries. My body tensed at sudden noises, as though expecting confrontation at every turn. I carried the prison with me, embedded deep in my nerves, proof that release did not mean escape. Yet the greatest scar was trust. I had once believed that blood was thicker than betrayal, that family, no matter how flawed, would never let one of their own fall completely. Now I knew better. The people who should have defended me had been the ones to orchestrate my ruin. They had not only taken my inheritance, but had shaped the world's perception of me into something unrecognizable. I walked through the city as a ghost, unseen yet too visible. Each step forward required effort. Each interaction demanded courage I wasn't sure I had. I wondered often if this was their final victory, not my imprisonment, but the lasting imprint of disgrace that followed me even in freedom. Still, beneath the scars, something stronger had taken root. Prison had hardened me, taught me endurance, forced me to discover strength in solitude. Now, those same lessons became the foundation for survival in a different kind of cage, a world that refused to forget. I began to understand that if I waited for society to restore my name, I would wait forever. Redemption would not be given. It would have to be built. I started small, taking jobs that others dismissed, working quietly and saving each coin. It was humiliating at times, to be treated as less, to hear the faint edge of disdain in employers' voices, but I reminded myself that I had endured worse. I carried trays, scrubbed floors, balanced accounts, all while keeping my gaze steady and my resolve firm. Each day of honest work became an act of defiance. Every paycheck, no matter how small, was proof that I could stand again without their fortune, without their name. I told myself that the scars were not only reminders of pain, but also markers of survival. They were proof that I had lived through what should have destroyed me. Freedom was not the triumph I once imagined. It was messy, raw, and heavy with ghosts. But it was mine. And though the world refused to welcome me back, I knew that with each step forward, I was carving a path they could never erase. The family had won battles. They had taken my dignity, my home, my freedom. But as I moved through the world with scars on my soul and defiance in my chest, I began to sense that the war was far from over. Freedom with scars left me hollow, but also strangely awake. I understood now that the world would not hand me dignity, nor would it rewrite the lies that had stained my name. If I wanted a future, I would have to build it from the ruins of everything I had lost. The first steps were humbling. I accepted work that others turned down, jobs that required silence, endurance, and no pride. I cleaned offices long after executives had gone home, stacked shelves in grocery stores under the indifferent gaze of customers, and filed endless papers in back rooms that smelled of dust and neglect. Each task was menial, each paycheck small, but each one carried meaning. They were not handouts from my family, not scraps thrown to silence me. They were earned by my own hands, carved from hours that no one could take from me. The shame I once felt began to transform into something steadier. When people looked down on me for the work I did, I reminded myself that they had not lived through the fire I had. They had not endured betrayal from their own blood, nor had they survived years of confinement for crimes they didn't commit. Their judgment was shallow compared to the depth of my survival. I saved obsessively. Each coin, each note, tucked away in jars and envelopes. I lived with discipline, eating little, buying nothing beyond necessity. For years I had been told that survival meant clinging to the inheritance. But now I saw survival for what it truly was, the ability to create without depending on anyone. Over time, the savings became enough to imagine something more. I started small, purchasing second-hand equipment and renting a modest space in a neighborhood where no one knew my name. The business was simple, bookkeeping services for small shops that couldn't afford larger firms. My years of education and experience, once overshadowed by scandal, became useful again. At first, clients hesitated. They saw my name, remembered the stories, and doubted. But when I delivered results with precision, when I treated their accounts with care, suspicion slowly gave way to trust. One shop turned into 3, then 5. Within a year, I had built something that was mine, fragile but real. The work consumed me, but it also healed me. Each ledger balanced felt like reclaiming a piece of the order my family had stolen from me. Each client who returned was proof that integrity still mattered, even in a world eager to believe lies. I reminded myself daily that while they had taken my inheritance, they had not taken my skill, my discipline, or my ability to rise. There were setbacks, of course. Some potential clients refused to meet me once they recognized my name. Others made comments laced with cruelty, reminding me of headlines that had branded me. Each rejection stung, but it no longer broke me. Instead, it hardened my resolve. I told myself that if 10 doors closed, I only needed one to remain open. Slowly, my life began to take shape again. The modest office became a sanctuary, a place where the past could not dictate the present. The shelves filled with binders of clients I had helped, each one a silent testimony to resilience. For the first time in years, I could look in the mirror without flinching, not because the scars were gone, but because I had learned to see them as part of my strength. At night, when I locked the office and stepped into the quiet streets, I thought about the long road I had traveled. From a family mansion filled with secrets, to a prison cell that nearly broke me, and now to a small rented office lit by fluorescent bulbs. It was not grandeur, not legacy as they had defined it, but it was honest, and it was mine. I knew then that this was only the beginning. What I had built from ashes would become the foundation for something greater, not just a business, but a new life, free from their control. The family had left me with nothing but scars, but those scars had become the blueprint for rebuilding. And though I had not yet faced them again, I felt the day approaching when I would return, not as the broken daughter they had discarded, but as the woman who had forged her own legacy from ruins. The years I spent rebuilding my life gave me something my family never expected, strength born not from privilege, but from survival. Every ledger I balanced, every small business that trusted me, every coin I saved became proof that I was no longer the discarded daughter they had once buried under scandal. I was whole again, not because they gave me anything, but because they had taken everything and I still endured. When the moment to face them arrived, it did not come with announcement or grandeur. It began with an invitation I had not expected, a family event dressed as tradition, a gathering where the name Moreno would be displayed proudly for the community to see. I knew at once why they wanted me there. It was not reconciliation. It was performance. They wanted the image of unity, to erase whispers of division by placing me silently at their table as if nothing had happened. I accepted, but not as the woman they remembered. I walked into that hall with scars hidden beneath a calm exterior, my documents carefully stored, and my resolve sharpened like steel. The room was heavy with perfume, fine suits, and polished smiles. To outsiders, it must have seemed like wealth incarnate, a family rooted in legacy. But I knew the truth behind the masks. They looked at me as though I were an intruder, an unwelcome reminder of a story they had tried to bury. Some whispered that I was bold to appear. Others muttered that my presence was inappropriate, yet I stood taller than I ever had. Their disapproval no longer carried the power it once did. I was not there to beg for inclusion. I was there to reveal what they had spent years concealing. When the moment came, I presented the evidence I had gathered with the help of those who finally believed in me. Documents showing the forged signatures, the offshore accounts, the discrepancies they had woven into my conviction. I did not need to raise my voice. The truth spoke loudly enough in the silence that followed. Their faces shifted from disdain to unease, then to the sharp edge of fear. The community that had once whispered against me now stared at them, watching their composure crack. Relatives who had proudly repeated the lies about my greed now avoided my gaze. I could feel the balance shifting in the room, the center of gravity moving away from their narrative toward the truth I carried. For the first time in years, the shame was not mine. It was theirs. They attempted to dismiss my revelations, calling them exaggerations, insisting that my suffering had been unfortunate but necessary. Yet their words no longer landed with authority. Too many eyes had seen the documents. Too many ears had heard the inconsistencies. The empire of appearances they had built trembled under the weight of facts they could not erase. I stood there not as the broken woman they had once cast aside, but as the survivor who had risen without their fortune, without their approval, without their name to shield me. I realized then that I no longer needed their acknowledgement. I had not come for their validation. I had come to show them, and everyone else, that I was stronger than their betrayal. The room emptied slowly after that, voices low, faces pale. My relatives retreated into silence, their legacy exposed for what it truly was: corruption wrapped in gold. I left with my head high, carrying nothing but the certainty that I had reclaimed the narrative they had stolen from me. That night, as I walked home through the quiet streets, I felt a calm I had never known. They could still speak against me, twist words, attempt to salvage what was left of their reputation. But none of it mattered anymore. The truth was out, and I no longer lived under their shadow. My return had not been about vengeance alone. It had been about proving to myself that I was no longer the victim of their choices. I had faced the storm they unleashed, survived it, and emerged with something greater than inheritance: freedom built on my own terms. The morning after my return to the family gathering, I woke not with the weight of dread that had once haunted me, but with a profound sense of stillness. For years, mornings had been reminders of battles I could not win, shadows I could not escape. Yet now, as sunlight spilled across my modest kitchen and the steam of my coffee curled upward, I realized something extraordinary. I was no longer bound to them. Their names, their judgments, their wealth, their manipulation, none of it defined me anymore. The chains they had forged, heavy with lies and cruelty, had finally fallen away. What remained was a woman who had walked through fire and carried no ashes, only the glow of survival. As I replayed the scene of the night before in my mind, I recognized that what mattered most was not the shame they had felt, nor the whispers of those who now looked at me with new eyes. What mattered was that I had spoken without trembling, presented the truth without apology, and walked away without needing their approval. For the first time in my life, I had not been the one abandoned. I had been the one to choose my own path. In the days that followed, calls and messages arrived. Some relatives confessed privately that they had always suspected something was wrong, but had been too afraid to stand against the Moreno name. Others tried to soften their stance, suggesting that perhaps I had exaggerated, as if lessening my suffering could protect their conscience. I answered little, spoke less, and listened most. Their words no longer pierced me. They were fragments of a world I had outgrown. What I felt instead was clarity. I understood now that vindication was not about their downfall. It was about my release. The prison they had cast me into had been made of stone and steel, but the truer prison had been the belief that I needed them, that my worth was tied to their recognition. Walking free from both had given me something they could never purchase: dignity. With that dignity came a new vision. I began to channel my work not only into rebuilding myself, but into helping others who had been silenced by power, injustice, or family cruelty. My small consulting practice grew into something larger, a network that offered guidance to those trapped in battles they thought they could never escape. Each story I heard reminded me that survival was not meant to be hoarded. It was meant to be shared, multiplied, and turned into light. There were still nights when the memories returned. The trial, the cold bars of the cell, the humiliation of being called a thief. But instead of crushing me, those memories became markers of how far I had traveled. Pain no longer defined me. It shaped me. Every scar was proof that I had chosen to stand again when surrender would have been easier. One evening, while walking home, I passed the gates of a grand estate, not unlike the one my family had once flaunted. Laughter echoed from its windows, and for a moment, I felt the familiar sting of exclusion. But then I remembered. My family's house had never truly been a home. Walls filled with wealth but absent of love are nothing but hollow monuments. I carried more warmth in my modest apartment, more honesty in my circle of chosen friends, than they ever would in their marble halls. In the quiet that followed, I understood that the inheritance I had once fought for no longer mattered. It had been poisoned long before it reached my hands. The true legacy I would leave behind was one I created myself: resilience, compassion, and the courage to build something untainted by greed. And so, my story was no longer one of betrayal alone, but of transformation. I was not the fallen daughter, nor the discarded heir, nor the prisoner they had branded me. I was Isabella Moreno, the woman who had been broken but refused to stay broken. If my journey has resonated with you, I ask you to take a moment now, like this story, share it with someone who may need strength, and subscribe so more voices like mine can rise above silence. Your support means more than you know, because every time we tell these stories, we remind one another that we are not alone. My parents and family tried to write me out of the narrative, but I found the courage to write my own. That is the power no inheritance can buy, and no prison can steal. That is my new legacy.